It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. Now we're going to talk to the author of A New History of the American So-Called Culture Wars. Far from over, of course. A CNN headline from last week, Americans are divided on culture war issues, a new CNN poll finds, as if they needed to tell you that. In some ways it was ever thus, right? But culture historian Isaac Butler argues that the techniques developed by the right, particularly in the last decades of the 20th century, are key to understanding what's happening today and worth knowing the history of. His new book is The Perfect Moment, God, Sex, Art, and the Birth of America's Culture Wars. You may know him from his work in podcasts, his Substack, his previous books on theater history, The Method, and The World Only Spins Forward, The Ascent of Angels in America. Hello, Isaac Butler. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian. It's amazing to hear your voice actually talking to me.
Oh, thanks. So you date this perfect moment, as you call it, as running from 1986 through the end of the Cold War to the start of the War on Terror after 9/11. Why that period?
Well, that is the first time that these kinds of political conflicts over American culture are explicitly called the culture wars. And so I thought it would be really fascinating to look at that exact period and figure out, well, what was it? What was going on? How did it work? What were its causes? What were its effects? And one thing that I quickly discovered is that a number of different factors were intersecting kind of all at the same time. So you have the religious right trying to increase its power both within the Republican Party and the country at large. You have the Cold War is, about to end at the beginning of it, and then it really ends. You have the AIDS crisis and the fight for LGBTQ freedom and liberation. And then you also have on top of that this really fascinating transition going on in our society where, what we called the post-war consensus is completely breaking down and kind of dissolving, and Americans lose the ability to agree on a kind of lot of different issues that most of us kind of agreed on for many years after World War II.
Right, though we could certainly argue that the so-called culture war was in full swing as early as the 1960s, right? The backlash to hippie counterculture, or whatever you want to call it, civil rights movement is kind of part of that. Women's lib, as they called it in the early 70s, yes. The environmental movement of that period, right? But something was going on in the mid-'80s that you particularly wanted to pinpoint.
Yes, what I really wanted to pinpoint was this specific conflict between the religious right and American artists, with the federal government kind of caught in the middle, about what kind of a country we were going to be, what our arts and culture are for, what the government's place in funding and supporting the arts are, and also about, a lot of that fight from the religious rights perspective was very specifically about tamping down on LGBTQ expression during the AIDS crisis. And I was really fascinated by that conflict and how artists and their allies fought back.
Right. And of course, Stonewall dates to 1969.
Yeah,
but
totally.
AIDS really flourished in the early 80s and through the 80s. And the title of your book, The Perfect Moment, comes from the name of the retrospective show of the artist Robert Mapplethorpe that was at the heart of one of the skirmishes in the 1980s culture wars. Remind us or introduce people to what was at stake with that show, which came to the center of attention when it was open at the Corcoran Gallery, or about to open at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington in 1989.
So basically, Robert Mapplethorpe is one of the most important photographers of the 20th century. He is not single-handedly, but one of the major figures responsible for the fact that we take photography on its own terms as seriously as a real art form. And early in his career, he shot a number of photos of people displaying their S&M fetishes. There's one of a man urinating in another's mouth, for example, that people were pretty upset by. And so there was a retrospective retrospective, a posthumous retrospective of his work that was due to come to Washington, D.C., to the Corcoran Gallery of Art. And that show had received direct funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. And so the religious right and its key ally in the Senate, Jesse Helms, saw this as an opportunity to really pounce and, because the photographs were so upsetting to so many people, to really use it to kind of beat up on the NEA and to try to rein the National Endowment for the Arts in. And one of the reasons why it became such a huge issue, why the perfect moment became the perfect moment, is, the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which doesn't exist anymore, was like 2 blocks away from the Capitol. I mean, it was really a stone's throw from Congress. And the then head of the Corcoran canceled the show under political pressure. And it moved from the Corcoran to this much scrappier artist-led organization called the Washington Project for the Arts, which, full disclosure, my mother joined the board of the WPA in the midst of this. Huh. And so that was like one of the first times that a museum had bowed to political pressure like that and canceled the show. And it really meant that, the symbol was, or the question was, is the art establishment, is the kind of centrist establishment art institutions, are they actually signing on to this? Are they saying that bowing under political pressure and censoring artists is okay? And it opened the floodgates to a huge amount of chaos, which culminated in both real life and in my book, an obscenity prosecution of a museum in Cincinnati that, as far as I can tell, is the kind of like first ever major obscenity prosecution of a museum and its director for the art on its walls in the United States.
And one of the other things in your book is the NEA 4 performance artists whose National Endowment for the Arts grants were canceled after a so-called decency standard got added to the rules. What was that about?
Yeah, so eventually what happens is the NEA gets these series of rules about what kind of art that it can fund that are very vague about, maintaining general standards of decency in its appropriations. And there's these 4 performance artists, Karen Finley, John Fleck, Holly Hughes, and Tim Miller. Not sure if any of them were ever guests on your show, Brian, but the 4 of them get their funding pulled. Their grants are approved and then their funding is canceled because of this rule. And they in turn sue the National Endowment for the Arts, which creates this very weird situation where, artists depend on the NEA. They are major supporters of the NEA. Some of the NEA 4 are continuing to apply to the NEA for grants, and they're also suing it to try to get this rule taken out on First Amendment grounds. Their basic argument, which is one that I firmly support, and I think we've seen the dangers of letting it go today during the Trump administration, is that the government isn't really supposed to use funding to pick ideological winners or losers. The point of funding is to advance certain goals. It's not to, say, well, you have to support the president's priorities or whatever. And that was really what was at stake in the NEA 4 case.
Listeners, anybody want to add your own oral history to this story by Isaac Butler in his new book of the late 20th century culture wars and the arts, particularly in the arts? Again, Isaac's background is more in writing books about theater. Now he's looking at this history of the culture wars pertaining to the arts in particular that really broke out in the 1980s in these particular ways. And obviously, and we'll get to this, we're seeing them today with Trump trying to control things at the Smithsonian and a lot of things like that. So listeners, did you play a part in this story yourself? Maybe you were one of the NEA 4 and you want to call in. 212-433 WNYC 212-433-9692. You can call or you could text. Is there an answer to who won that battle? Didn't the Karen Finley case, and I guess some of the reasons that they were trying to censor her, there was nudity, there was profanity. There certainly were politics. I think there was poop in one case, something like that. You tell me.
It was chocolate sauce, not poop. But yes,
representing.
Representing. Yes. There was a.
But that went to the Supreme Court, right?
Went to the Supreme Court, and we lost. The artists lost, very explicitly. The Supreme Court ruled. It's a weird kind of splitting the baby ruling, where they both ruled that the government actually does have, a perfectly legitimate interest in saying, the art we fund needs to be decent, but they also ruled that it was an advisory text, that it didn't really mean anything. So there's this very weird kind of double ruling that comes out that of all people, Scalia is very annoyed about. Because he just thinks at the time, the government has the right to pursue whatever ideological ends it wants, and that doesn't impact the First Amendment at all. So it's a really interesting time. But the weird thing is that the religious right doesn't exactly win either, because, of course, anyone who lived through the 90s knows pop culture, American culture only got more permissive during that period. The government-funded culture did not, but American popular culture did. So, you have a decade that begins with The Simpsons being a scandal and ends with South Park being a hit, right? If you could have told people who were upset about the, underachiever and proud of it Bart Simpson t-shirts, well, just you wait a few years until Eric Cartman gets created, I don't think they would have believed you.
The character Cartman. Yeah. Karen Finley, by the way, was once on the show when she wrote a book about some of her experiences.
Oh, amazing.
Here is Anne in Brooklyn, who maybe is not a supporter entirely of the point of view you're representing. Anne, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Hi. So I might have missed part of the conversation, but okay, I appreciate art. I come from a family of artists. I couldn't be more progressive. But you're kidding yourself if you don't think that objection to the Mapplethorpe work is legitimate and the outrage was real. And if you have to push all those boundaries, this is the counter reaction you're going to get. I have the Mapplethorpe book. The photos are absolutely nauseatingly cruel and pornographic and way beyond normal sensibility. So maybe that's great for some people, but if you push it, you're going to get that reaction from art funders and even regular people like me who support funding for the arts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for weighing in. And I think Anne's call, and not to take a side, is very representative of the conversations that people were having at that time and that people were divided over genuinely, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think people have a right to be offended by whatever they want to be offended by. The question is there's two questions that are kind of embedded there. Whether transgression is a legitimate function of art, and I believe it is. I mean, one of the things that's going on during this period is that the LGBTQ perspective and the perspective of people with AIDS has been totally shut out of most areas of the public square. And so, it is finding its expression through art. And it's not only the Mapplethorpe stuff that, the people attacking the NEA are objecting to. They're really objecting to, to give one example, Holly Hughes, one of the NEA 4, her work was not that explicit. The objection to her work was that she was a lesbian, talking openly about being a lesbian. So part of it is that there's this real question of who gets to decide what is beyond the pale and what's not. And one of the things that art does is transgress boundaries. I mean, Manet is transgressing boundaries, right? So the real question comes down to, is the government's, if the government is going to choose to fund the arts, do they have to do that in such a way that they agree with a specific community's point of view about what is and is not decent? And I just don't think that's correct. I don't even like the work of Robert Mapplethorpe very much. I'm not a huge fan of The Flowers or the porn, the XYZ portfolio, which is the stuff with the sex acts in it. But that is not actually particularly important. What's important is whether or not the government whether or not the government has the right to fund art in all of its varieties. And I believe it should.
My guest, if you're just joining us for another few minutes, is culture historian Isaac Butler, whose new book is The Perfect Moment, God, Sex, Art, and the Birth of America's Culture Wars, and kind of goes from 1986 or so to the present and how what happened in the 80s and 90s and up through around 9/11, 2001 set the stage for things that are happening now. And here's one very high-profile moment from that period. It's Pat Buchanan speaking at the 1992 Republican National Convention. He had challenged incumbent President George H.W. Bush for the Republican nomination that year. From the culture war right, he was really MAGA before MAGA in so many respects. And he said this in his convention speech.
There is a religious war going on in this country. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
So to him, it maybe was as important as the Cold War.
It's not just to him. You know, there's times during this story in this book where essentially, like, above the fold in the newspaper, you have the Berlin Wall coming down, and below the fold in the newspaper, you have a controversy over some $2,000 grant to a small arts organization. You know what I mean? Or one of the other big ones is, one of these controversies makes the front page of the Daily News the night after David Dinkins becomes New York City's first black mayor, right? So people are taking this stuff really, really, really seriously. I mean, as an artist, as an arts advocate, one of the things that I love about this story is it actually is a moment when the nation took the arts very, very seriously, often much more seriously than they do now. The weird thing is, I do think that, Buchanan, that speech is so ugly that some people feel like it cost George H.W. Bush re-election, right? And George W. Bush, after Buchanan gave the speech, turned to someone nearby and said, "This is a disaster." And he was right. But what he did accurately name was that there was this major conflict about what it meant to be American and who got to count in the American experiment going on in America's arts. And thus, political actors all over the place were pouncing on it.
And he was very anti-immigrant, Pat Buchanan. And
his 92 platform says build the wall. It's tariffs and build the wall. That's his 92 platform. So, right. I mean, it really is a flat circle.
And we certainly talked about this on the show at the time in 2016 when Trump got elected, that Pat Buchanan 1992 speech that we just excerpted from, that got written off by so many people as horrifyingly radical. Well, basically we elected that.
Yes, we absolutely did. And so one of the things that was fascinating about my book and about the process of doing my book was, Trump was reelected halfway through the writing of it. And at that point, there was a real fork in the road about whether I wanted to directly address events today in the book or stick to the original plan, which was, this is a work of history. I'm trying to illuminate it as honestly as I possibly can, including in parts where, I disagree with stuff or I have learned that my own assumptions were wrong. I want to just honestly tell this story and report it out and do the research and do that? Or do I need to sort of openly talk about the lessons I've learned from this story for today? And what I eventually decided was that as a writer, I want to create space for the reader. I want to create space for the reader to disagree with me, to come to their own conclusions, to have their own thoughts about it, to be inspired or angry or, whatever reaction they're going to have. And that if I pivoted in that way and talked about the issues of today all the time, I would be eliminating that space for the reader. And that as a historian, my job is to really tell the story of the past. It is not actually to make a big polemic about the future, although I'm happy to do that in interviews or essays or whatever. But in the book itself, I really wanted to stick to that time.
Before we end, I'm going to take one call who wants to kind of stick the landing in the present. So Andrew in Jersey City, hang on. We're going to get to you in a second. But I also want to acknowledge that a number of listeners are writing in to remind everybody of the New York City component of this. Of course, there were many New York City components of this,
many.
But a particular one where it wasn't the federal government trying to cancel arts funding, but the New York City government under Mayor Giuliani.
Yes.
When the Brooklyn Museum, here listener writes, reminds me of the uproar in the 90s about the cross immersed in urine at the Brooklyn Museum. That was in an art exhibit, that particular piece. I went to the Brooklyn Museum back then to see that exhibit after it got all that press. And it was, the artist whose name I'm forgetting, you can probably remind me, was I think he was trying to critique he was Catholic, I believe, and was trying to critique certain things the Catholic Church was doing at that time by immersing a cross in a bodily fluid. But you tell me.
Well, there's actually two different works of art that I think might be getting conflated here. In the actual photograph, am I allowed to say the name of it? It's called Piss Christ.
We're not.
Oh, we're not. I'm sorry. So sorry.
We can. Okay. You said it. That's all right.
We said it. I apologize. The initial photograph from the 1980s was by Andre Serrano, who is a Catholic. He actually eventually met the Pope. He met Pope Francis, and is if you ask him, it is not a critique of anything. It's a formal thing, and he had a cross lying around because he's obsessed with crosses. I'm not sure that I believe that, but it is an expression of a sincere questioning Catholic faith. Similarly, at the end of the story, it's actually the epilogue of my book. There's this exhibit from the UK called Sensation that Rudy Giuliani tries to get closed. He tries to cut the Brooklyn Museum's funding. He tries to evict them from their land, et cetera, and so forth. And that involves a painting by Chris O'Feely that is now at the MoMA called The Holy Virgin Mary, that, among other things, has elephant dung in it, which is a reference to traditional...
That's right. I was conflating those two.
And that's a reference to traditional African art making practice. He is not trying to smear the Virgin Mary with poop. You know what I mean? And Chris O'Feely is, of course, of African descent. That's the epilogue of my book. The title of that chapter is called Again as Farce, if you want some sense of kind of the tone of what that time was, because Giuliani was picking a fight he had no hope of winning. The arts are just they're hugely powerful in New York City. And it's actually, the weird thing is, as you well remember, and I do from living through it, those incidents turned him into a laughingstock. And the thing that really changed his reputation, and you turned it, was the attacks of September 11th, which also kind of put the culture war on ice for a while as we pivoted into the war on terror.
So here's Andrew in Jersey City, who's going to land us in the present, then we're out of time. Andrew, you're on WNYC. Hi.
How you doing? Good day. How are you?
Good.
So I was just curious because it's all. I think your guest said it's all in who decides. I mean, our country has no problem watching cage fights on the White House lawn, and that's hard. I mean, I don't know it. It's disgusting, but we're okay with that. But some of these things are quite. It's a matter of what you're willing to accept. But I mean, I'm okay as long as it doesn't violate anybody's rights and it's people consenting to do what they want to do. But it's really kind of weird. I find the whole concept really weird. That's just my comment.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the cage match, UFC cage match on the White House lawn for Flag Day. Well, that's somebody else's idea of obscenity, Isaac.
Yes, absolutely. And, the way that the NEA was designed was to kind of designed around trying to stop any one person from having that kind of power to say what is and is not decent, what is and is not good even. The NEA actually was designed not to award grants directly. One of the brilliant things in its design is it involves peer review panels. So it's people from all over the art world are working together to decide what should get this funding. And the people who work for the NEA actually have very little say in it. And that was actually its genius, was that way that it isolated the art world from the government and vice versa while providing a lot of funding. And the results, which is to say the renaissance in American art over the second half of the 20th century in both the performing and visual forms, I think really speak for themselves.
And there we leave it with Isaac Butler. His new book is called Perfect Moment. Wait, I'm getting the rest of... You say it. Say your whole book title.
It's called The Perfect Moment, God, Sex, Art, and the Birth of America's Culture Wars.
And if you want to see Isaac Butler in person, he will be at Books Are Magic on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights tomorrow night at 8 in conversation with Emily Nussbaum. You can find out about tickets and streaming at booksarenmagic.net. And the Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria has put together a series related to the book called Culture Wars. It runs from June 26th through July 12th with films including Last Temptation of Christ, Poison and Quills. Isaac Butler will be there for the last Temptation of Christ screening on the 27th, which is this Saturday. Check it out at movingimage.org. Thanks for the conversation, Isaac. Really, really appreciate the history.
Oh, man, thank you so much for having me on, Brian.